Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome WSWA President and CEO, Craig Wolf.
Thank you, thank you. All right, so almost good afternoon, still late morning, good morning then, but almost afternoon. We're going to go through the afternoon with a number of sessions. So welcome officially to the 2016 US Beverage Alcohol Forum. I am Craig Wolf. I'm the President and CEO of WSWA. I hope you all had a great convention. As I talked about this morning, this is our largest convention that, in terms of numbers and that I've been here at WSWA. It's now my 16th year, 10th as CEO, and we had over 2,850 people this year, which is about 350 more than 2 years ago in Vegas. So a great turnout, and I hope everybody had a very beneficial time here. So many people, though, don't realize they come to the convention that this is really one of the best parts of the entire show, to really learn about what it is to be in this business. And you'll experience some of the educational value of that over the next couple hours. We trust you've made some important contacts, obviously, during the past couple of days. And we're here now to help you take your business to the next level. Now, our industry is built upon relationships. But to succeed, you also need business intelligence, knowledge of the market, how to best operate within the sandbox. And that's what you get from the US Beverage Alcohol Forum. So to start off today, we're going to bring you a panel on trends, what's happening in the US and globally. We'll also hear from a panel of mixologists who will discuss what's popular on the streets. Now, we're going to start out with hearing from Mark Meek, who is the CEO of IWSR. The IWSR publishes beverage alcohol market category and brand performance data in 155 countries across the world. Mark has years of experience with data and business insights, having worked at both Data Monitor and Progressive Digital Media. We are pleased to welcome to the stage Mark Meek.
Thank you, Craig, and good morning to you all. So as Craig said, over the next 10 or 15 minutes, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what's happening in terms of key global trends, more importantly to this audience here, what's happening in the US, and then talk about craft trends, which obviously everyone's talking about. Right throughout this presentation, there's 4 key themes, if you like, in terms of what's happening globally and here in the US. And in no particular order, they are the following. The continued and rapid growth of US whiskey, as we know here. But I think as I show you some slides later on in a few minutes, I think some of you might be surprised just quite how popular and what the potential is for US whiskey outside the US. So that's the first thing. US whiskey is on fire. The second thing is increasing premiumization. So people are drinking better and better quality. And again, that's backed up by the figures that I'll show you in this presentation. So that's the second one. The third one in this market, and it's being driven by this market, but you're seeing it in the UK, in the gin sector, you're seeing it in Germany, in beer and others, is the increasing importance of craft. So that is the third one. And last but not least, and it's kind of linked to the craft piece, is the continued rise of independence. Independent companies operating in the sector. So those are the kind of 4 key themes that we are seeing both here in the US and across the globe. So very briefly, if we look at global volumes for all kind of key spirit categories for standard and above, I mean, the story over the last 5 years and the story for the next 5 years is really pretty simple. No growth, really. And that is the story of what we're seeing both for the past 5 years and the future 5 years. But if I was going to pick out one point from this slide, and it's what I mentioned earlier, is, currently in terms of global volumes, US whiskey for standard and above is neck and neck with gin. And we're forecasting that by 2020, US whiskey globally will overtake gin volumes. Now that is quite a seismic shift because gin, although not, I know it's growing popularity here, but it's a huge market in terms of volumes in Spain, Philippines, UK. So that's, if you like, seismic shift number 1. As I mentioned earlier, standard, and you'll see it the same reflected in the US, is where you're seeing good growth and substantial growth across all categories across the globe is premium and above. So all categories, even vodka, although less marked than some of the other categories, all categories are predicted to show growth over the next 5 years. But the key statistic or point to pick out from here is US whiskey. Again, US whiskey, we're forecasting for continued growth and substantial growth across all markets. A point I wanted to make to this audience, and at the IWSR, it's something we constantly talk about, is we know US whiskey is obviously, and brown spirits are very popular in the US, but here in the US, you have huge potential in terms of the capacity of new distilleries coming on every week and every month and every year, in terms of capacity for really increasing your presence outside the US with US whiskey. Why? Because, as I say, across all the markets that we travel to, US whiskey is really popular with the consumers, particularly new entrants to the category, because they see US whiskey and bourbon has a easier to adopt a taste profile than some of the other whiskeys. But it also has a cachet that is very attractive to many consumers outside the US. And last but not least, it's a very competitive market, as we know here in the US, in all categories, but including US whiskey. Whereas perhaps it's a less crowded marketplace outside the US. It's dominated by one or two brands, Jack Daniels and others. So real potential. One other thing out in terms of this slide before I move on. I mean, who would have thought that in terms of premium and above, globally, US whiskey volumes would start to approach and get very close to vodka. And if you continue that trend, I mean, it does seem to us that it might even take vodka. Now, no one would have thought that a number of years ago. If we look at the US, it's very similar in terms of standard and above, in terms of similar picture to global. Apart from US whiskey, no real growth over the last 5 years and no real growth of any note over the next 5 years. Again, as we see globally, premium and above is where it's all happening, if you like. With pretty substantial, apart from vodka, but some growth in vodka, but pretty substantial growth across all key categories, with US whiskey really leading the way. This just reinforces previous points I've made. If you look back 5 or 6 years ago, vodka had a bigger market share in the US. So this is for premium and above. Vodka had a bigger market share, by some margin in terms of percentage points versus US whiskey. Today, 15 or 20, US whiskey has a bigger market share. Now, again, not many people would have predicted this, if you were looking at this market in 2010. So the growth has been very impressive. A very quick look at the 5 fastest growth brands globally. Well, as you see, they are dominated by US brands, and I talked about the rise of the independents. 2 of those brands, as we know, are independent companies. So you have Fireball leading the way, Tito's, Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, and a Ukrainian vodka. Interesting or not, if you took out the US market and looked at the globe and excluded the US, the only brand that would be there would be Jack Daniels in the top 5. And for what it's worth, the other brands are either Russian or Ukrainian vodkas of what some would say of not the greatest quality. But that's just, I suppose, a point of note. If you look at the 5 fastest growing brands in the US, and by the way, these numbers are 2014, our data, 2015 data comes out in May of each year. Now, there might be some variances here, but it does tell the same story. Now, the key point here, if you look at this slide, is again, as I mentioned earlier, 2 of those brands, the top 2 are actually independents brands, and they're not multinational. So again, that's a shift from what we would have seen 5 or 10 years ago. The other point to note from this 5 fastest growing brands here in the US is 3 of those brands either dramatically reduced their advertising spend year on year, or didn't increase their advertising spend. And actually, here in the US, one really well-known brand, which I'm not going to mention, but one incredibly well-known whiskey brand substantially increased their advertising spend in 2015, and actually their volumes went down. So that is another shift in the market. If you went back 5 or 10 years ago, you were pretty sure, not definite, you were pretty sure if you put some advertising dollars behind a brand, you were going to see increases in volumes. That's not the case anymore. And I'll talk a little bit about that, why we think that is in the future. So increased advertising spend, and it makes it very difficult for marketeers. Increased advertising spends in this new connected internet world that we now live in doesn't mean just by definition increased volumes. Craft. Everyone's talking about craft. So in terms of, everyone says, wherever we go, whatever conversations we have, and by the way, I'm trying to time myself before I use the M word to describe the young, and it's not what the hip-hop generation calls young people, because that'd be too rude for the morning session here. But in terms of what is the craft, what is defined as craft, is it doesn't really matter what we at the IWSR think craft is, and actually, to be honest, anyone in this room or any associations, what they feel defines craft. Actually, the real answer to what defines craft is what the consumer actually thinks. And that's the key. And one of the things we're working on with Park Street and the American Craft Spirits Association is through, and Nielsen and other partners, is we're looking at doing an industry-wide study which we'll release in July. And one of the main component parts of that report will be looking brand by brand what consumers identify as craft, because that's the answer. Now, having said all that, craft in terms of what we're hearing from consumers and what we know from the market, should either have all or some of these categories, or these qualities: authenticity, heritage, locality, and quality. That's what, if you like, should be the key identifying parts in terms of a craft spirit. The key drivers, we all know, it's self-explanatory. Key driver in terms of craft movement is a huge number of increased distilleries that are opening up here in the US. So, double, treble what it was 5 or 10 years ago. And let me give you an interesting statistic, and I'll come back to why there's such an opportunity for US whiskey. Is if you look at Scotland and if you look at Ireland, so in Scotland, in the next 3 to 5 years, there's 8 new distilleries coming on stream. In Ireland, there's 11. If you compare that to the US, it's almost 8 to 10 to 11 to 20 per month. So the capacity that you guys hear is huge in comparison in terms of production capacity, whatever happens in Scotland, in Ireland, and it really presents an opportunity. So what consumer groups are driving growth? So I took a bet with my team that I'd get 3/4 through the way before mentioning millennials. So what are the 3 real battlegrounds, if you like, for consumers in this sector? So in no particular order, they are millennials, female consumers, and multicultural audience or consumer segment. Now, not to ignore very important consumer segments, which is traditional consumers of spirits, and it's not to ignore the grey market and other markets. But this is what we're seeing. This is where marketeers are really trying to win out. And the companies that are going to be successful are the ones that actually dominate in either 1, 2, or 3 of these particular consumer segments. We all know in the US that the millennials represent, in terms of dollar for dollar, the biggest consumer segment that any FMCG can target their marketing efforts. So we know that. The point I wanted to make here about millennials is we're involved in lots and lots of discussions about craft, millennials, et cetera, et cetera. So we've started looking at extensive studies that have been produced, looking at millennials' attitudes to loyalty to brands. And the common perception is that millennials aren't brand loyal. Well, we would actually dispute that. There are studies, and many meaningful studies, that actually millennials are loyal to brands. The difference between millennials and other age segmentations, baby boomers, et cetera, the key difference is, whereas previous generations were loyal to one or two brands. Because of this internet-connected world, millennials are loyal to a multitude of brands. Point number one. Point number two, at your peril in this interconnected world, millennials are incredibly savvy. At your peril, have claims of authenticity, heritage, quality that aren't 100% true, because you'll get found out in a second, and it'll be all over social media, and your brand will be in deep trouble. So those are key sort of points that we see and conversations that we come up against when we have discussions regarding this particular audience segmentation. Coming to the end of the presentation, here's the other fundamental shift in this industry, is the incredible rise of brands, very, very quick rise of brands and quick declines. If you look at this chart, just two examples of many, if you look at Svedka vodka, it took 10 years. 10 years to achieve substantial volumes and success. New Amsterdam vodka, 2 or 3 years. Lower down on that chart, you then see what happens with brands. They rise very quickly and they decline very quickly. And I know the panelists, this is one of the topics of discussion, is the key challenge, or a key challenge, is how do you make your brand continue to live for lengthy periods of times? And it is a challenge indeed. In summary and to end, I've been talking about millennials and us living in this interconnected and world of the internet. Here's the difference between what we would have seen in a bar 5, 10, 15 years ago. We would have walked up to a bar, and it was physical. We would have walked up to a bar, and for each category, what would we have seen? Probably 3 or 4 brands maximum for each category, and they're pretty much multinational brands in the main. The difference now is a bar of the future in the interconnect is not physical. It's huge. The potential for brands to make a name for themselves through online channels, particularly globally, but increasingly so here in the US, is the choice is infinite. And the key to success to players in this industry, and it's what we're seeing the astute organizations doing. The key in this bar of the future, with multitude of choice category by category, the key to the future is the following, is look at consumption occasion very, very carefully, consumption occasion by consumption occasion, and try your damnedest to make sure that in that particular consumption occasion, you have a brand that has relevance. And that, I think, from where we're seeing in terms of the future of this market, we think is what will define success and failure, amongst the other factors I mentioned earlier. That's it from me, and thank you very much. Thank you.